Welcome to Limitless, the Blind Beginnings podcast where seeing things differently inspires limitless possibilities. This podcast is being brought to you by Blind Beginnings, an organization based in Vancouver, Canada, that supports children and youth who are blind or partially sighted, along with their families. Limitless was created in order to inform, educate, entertain, and share stories from within the blind and partially sighted community, in order to show the world that the opportunities for those who are blind or partially sighted are truly limitless. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce you to your host, the Executive Director and Founder of Blind Beginnings, Shawn Marcellet.
Welcome back to Limitless, the Blind Beginnings podcast. I'm your host, Shawn Marcellet, and I'm so excited about today's episode. But first, I want to introduce my co-host, Jinnie. Welcome back, Jinnie.
Hello. Excited to be here.
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking to an author that you introduced me to, and I actually read 2 of her books over the last week, and loved them. So why don't you tell us who we're meeting and introduce our guest?
Okay, so today we have Amanda Leduc, who is a disabled author and has written 3 books. One of which is a nonfiction book called Disfigured, The Miracles of Ordinary Men, and her latest release, which is The Centaur's Wife.
Welcome, Amanda.
Hi, guys. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I feel, I guess, bad to say I hadn't heard of you until a couple weeks ago.
Okay.
And then Jinnie.
For a lot of writers, most people haven't really heard of us unless your book gets made into a movie, so it's fine.
Yeah, I guess that's true. But I consumed Disfigured, and then I thought I consumed it. I read it over maybe like 4 or 5 days, and then on Sunday, I read The Centaur's Wife from beginning to end. And I have a 7-year-old son, so like to get a whole book read on a weekend is sort of unheard of.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah, they were both great. Do you want to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name's Amanda Leduc, and I am a writer currently based in Hamilton, Ontario. I have cerebral palsy, and I work as the Communications and Development Coordinator for the Festival of Literary Diversity, which is a literary festival based in Brampton, which promotes diverse and marginalized authors throughout the year at a literary festival that we hold in May, and then we also have a kids festival that we hold in the fall. And I've been working with the Fold for about 5-6 years now. And the reason that I mention that is because it was really through working with the Fold that I became more aware of my role and responsibility as a disabled writer. I became much more comfortable talking openly about my disability through working with the Fold and looking at how different marginalizations, particularly the marginalization of disability, functions in the world. So my last 2 books, so Disfigured, which is the nonfiction book, came out in February of last year. It was published by Coach House Books, who are based in Toronto. And that is a nonfiction book that's sort of a memoir combined with an analysis of fairy tales and the role of disability specifically in fairy tales, and how traditional portrayals of disability, like the old hunchbacked villain or the dwarfs in Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, for example, how those kinds of simplistic disability portrayals have really persisted into culture and society as we know it today, and how those portrayals are responsible for many of the ways that society views disability. And The Centaur's Wife, which is my new novel, which just came out with Random House Canada, really plays on that thesis. It's a post-apocalyptic narrative that also mixes in original fairy tales, and it looks at why we tell stories and how we tell stories to, move through and beyond trauma, and then also how we tell stories to make sense of disability in the world. And so that's sort of where I'm at right now. I also have another novel that came out in 2013, my first book, called The Miracles of Ordinary Men, as Jinnie mentioned. I'm just loving the written word and loving the opportunity to talk more about disability in the written word, I think, specifically.
So I grew up with a visual impairment, and so can relate to sort of living with a disability my whole life. And one thing that really struck me in the introduction to Disfigured was mentioning person first versus identity first language. And I've always kind of referred to myself as a blind person, or I work with blind children, even though I wanted to say children and youth who are blind or partially sighted, because that's what I feel like I've always felt like I'm supposed to say that, but it hasn't really fit for me. And I noticed you're referring to yourself as a disabled author. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that, because it was really enlightening for me and almost like gave me permission to reclaim the word blind.
Yeah. So this is a bit of an interesting journey for me. I think so I've had, cerebral palsy my whole life. I've walked with a limp my whole life, but I do have a lot of able-bodied privilege. I can do and access most things that traditionally able-bodied people can do. And when I was younger, when I was in elementary school specifically, I was bullied quite a bit because of the way that I walked, and just the way that I moved through the world was different, made fun of and that sort of thing. And I think one of the coping mechanisms that I developed was this sort of sense of like, oh, I'm not disabled, because disabled, was made out to be a bad thing. It was this thing that I was made fun of for. And so my narrative for a long time became about proving to the world that I was not disabled, that I could do everything that everybody else could do. But at the same time, I also was quite open about the fact that I had cerebral palsy, and open about the fact that it was something interesting. It was an interesting story that I always had to tell people, these different experiences that I had. But the key for me was that I was thinking about that experience as somehow separate and apart from the idea of disability, because I was thinking that disability and owning up to disability, acknowledging disability in my life, was tantamount to saying that my life was somehow less than a non-disabled life. And I did my master's degree in Scotland about a decade ago. And for a while after, I lived in Edinburgh. And one of the people that I worked at an organization that provided support services to people with disabilities. And my boss at one point was like, oh, I'm excited to see your journey. You're going to be known as a disabled writer. And my instant response to her was to say, oh no, I'll be a writer with a disability. I didn't want to put disabled first, again, because I was thinking that if I say I'm a disabled writer, people are just going to think that disability is the only thing that's about me, and the only thing I'm qualified to talk about or to write on. And I don't want to be that way, because I don't want, this lesser thing to be the focus of my life. And it really took a few more years, probably about the next 5 years or so, from hearing that from my boss, to really get to a point where I started to interrogate that thinking and started to really realize that, I had already been existing in the space where, to all intents and purposes, I was thinking about myself as a disabled person, because I have this condition that has shaped my life in very particular ways. And I was comfortable talking about that, but I was not comfortable claiming the word disabled. And it took a long time for me to understand that the problem was not with the word disabled itself, but the ways that society views the word disabled, right? The way that the non-disabled world sort of automatically thinks that if you're disabled, oh, it means that, you can't work and you can't do all these other things. And you're sort of, you live this sad little life. And there's no interrogation there about the ways in which society is actually responsible in many ways for creating those kinds of perceptions and misconceptions that we have about disability. So understanding that was a real revelation. I know I've rambled on lots, but that, getting to that point and really thinking about how identity first has really structured my work and my advocacy going forward has been a huge part of my work within the last couple of years.
We were actually talking about this at a staff meeting earlier, because I brought it up because it was so awesome. But organizationally, I guess where it gets tricky, like I really do believe even within the blindness world, there's some people prefer a person with a visual impairment. Some people prefer partially sighted, some low vision, some blind. There's huge variation. And my general rule is listen to how the person describes themselves and use that terminology. But when you're when you're talking on behalf of an entire group, how do you get around that?
I do think that, I try as much as possible to, if someone gives me a preference for language that they would rather have person first as opposed to identity first, I absolutely, will follow that. I think it's important. One of the things that I try and reach for in my own particular brand, if you will, of disability activism is in reaching for, the world that I would like to have. And the world that I would like to have is a world where we understand that everybody occupies different bodies and everybody moves through the world in a different way and has different needs. And it's just important that we meet all of these needs. So, if you see someone with a limp like myself, you just sort of automatically understand that, not that, oh, this person needs to be pitied or something like that, just that, oh, that person moves differently. So maybe stairs are difficult for them. So if we're at an outing, maybe we'll just make sure to avoid somewhere that, has stairs. Mm-hmm. So it's really about care. It's really, I think, about, this world that I'm searching for is a world in which we recognize the unique, valuable things about everybody. And in order to do that, I think we first need to call attention to the fact that the world does not care for all of us equally in the same way. And society is not built to care for us all in the same way. And the way that we do that is by drawing attention to inaccessibility. And the way that we draw attention to inaccessibility is by drawing attention to the word disabled and, really shining a light on the ways in which the world and the society that we live in continues to disable people. It's not, people, I think, in many ways shy away from the word disabled because it's somehow synonymous with a moral failing of some kind. But it's not a moral failing. It's nobody's fault that they're disabled. There's nothing wrong with a body that's disabled. It may be a body that requires different kinds of care. It may be a body that, experiences pain and fatigue and all of these kinds of things, which are difficult elements of the disabled experience. Absolutely. But I think in searching, in reaching for a world that recognizes the need for this kind of care, we need to understand that the language that we use is important, and the language that we use is responsible for the world that we're in now, right? Which is a world that keeps disabled people out of things in many ways. It starts with the language. It starts with how you speak about people and how you talk. And so when I speak about disabled people as a group, I'm using that kind of language because I'm reaching for that world. I want us to get there. But I do absolutely recognize that, there are preferences for identity first, and I think those are totally valid. I just think they're built on an assumption, which, maybe we should question that assumption, right? Mm-hmm. My disability is not the sole focus of who I am, but it's an important part of who I am. And there shouldn't be anything wrong or anything less with acknowledging that.
I'm curious if there's a difference between people who have an acquired disability versus a congenital disability, and in their preference of language. Have you noticed that at all?
Yeah. I think there is definitely a difference. I mean, I think the experience of disability hits everyone differently, right? Because disability is so widely varied and impacts so many people in so many different ways that your journey for sort of figuring out how it operates in your own life does have its own sort of timetable. Mm-hmm. Again, though, I think, if you look at someone who has an acquired disability, and obviously this is a generalization, but I think there's a real process there that happens, right? Where you have to let go of the body and the life that you used to have and understand that you're living in a new body and in a new reality. And the world at large has real trouble with those kinds of transitions, right? Like real trouble with understanding that someone can be, quote unquote, all of these things before, and somehow, once they become disabled, they are somehow not those things. It's just kind of understood that they don't carry over these, parts of themselves into their new disabled life. And I just think we need to question that more. We really need to understand that the ways that we view disability are not set in stone and deserve to be interrogated and deserve to be, of discussed. And is this really best for everybody? Is this something that we can grow and improve on?
I definitely agree with that. And I think I personally never thought of it that way. Like, I know, working with Shawn and kind of being one of her youth has helped me develop this. But I feel like even as a writer, I don't think this way, because for every class I've taken, I've refused to write a story with a person with a disability in it. Mm-hmm. I don't know why. I just don't. And I think it's because it's like, oh, that's what my professor is probably assuming I'm going to write about, or that's what my classmates are assuming that I'm going to write about. And I think the only time I ever did it was when I think my workshop group was like, why don't you write about this? And they asked me, and I was like, I don't know. I just don't. And they're like, well, that's what we want to read. Like, we've read everything else. Mm-hmm. That's what we want to hear. And I feel like your point to the fact that trying to sort of hide it, like, if we don't acknowledge it, who will? Because if we're so afraid of it, then society is going to be afraid of it as well. And I think that's a really important point that you make about pity as well. But I feel like also looking on the other side, you talk about inspiration porn in your book as well. Mm-hmm. And I know that for a lot of able-bodied people, that is sometimes hard to understand, to see where we're coming from. Have you discovered a succinct way of explaining that?
Inspiration porn is a tricky one, right? Because I think people always mean well.
Yeah.
when they are, saying things like, oh, look at what they overcame, blah, 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 all those kinds of things. And that is lovely. But what they don't realize, the focus is not where it should be, right? They're thinking, oh my gosh, look at all these, especially in the case of Paralympic athletes, right? Oh my gosh, look at what they overcame to, do this thing. And they're not recognizing a whole bunch of other elements that are built into that. Namely, the reason that life becomes difficult for people, particularly when they, are born able-bodied or non-disabled and then become disabled, is that, the world puts barriers in place for people. And so when you look at someone and say, oh my gosh, you're so, inspiring for going about their regular life and shopping at the supermarket or getting a coffee or whatever, people are saying, oh my gosh, you're amazing, because if I was you, if I was in your place, I would not be able to do the same thing. Like, I would just be so consumed by how sad my life is, which is really kind of a terrible thing to say to somebody, right? Because it's basically admitting that you think that their life is sad and not worth living, not worth, having joy over. And in the case of, coming back to the Paralympic athletes, one of the other things that's built in there is Paralympic athletes are athletes, like, just because someone is disabled and, runs the 100-meter dash, or becomes disabled and then goes on to run the 100-meter dash, like, not everybody who is disabled will decide to do those things. I am not going to suddenly decide to really, overcome my disability and learn how to run a marathon or things like that. Like, people don't understand that. They sort of, and this goes kind of back to the thesis of Disfigured, right? Where this idea that disabled people either overcome, quote unquote, all of their challenges, or they sort of, succumb to the pain and suffering of their disability. And I think it's really a simplistic way to view things. I think inspiration porn is a simplistic way of furthering that narrative, right? Look at everything that you've overcome. Look at what you've managed to do despite all the difficulties in your life. Well, a lot of those difficulties are because of the way that society is built. And if we changed the way that society is built, I wouldn't have those difficulties anymore. So I just think that inspiration porn becomes difficult because it puts the onus of solving the problem, quote unquote, of disability onto the disabled person's shoulders, right? It means that society has no responsibility to change or to make things better. It's up to you to, train and participate in the Paralympics. because they can all do it. See all the disabled people who are participating on TV. Why can't you do it? It pits disabled people against one another. This whole idea of inspiration porn and some people being able to do some things and other people not being able to do it. And I just think we need to normalize building a better world rather than, highlighting people that manage to overcome that imperfect world in which we are currently living.
Yeah, we wouldn't expect every able-bodied person to go to the Olympics, so we shouldn't assume that every disabled person will.
Exactly. Well, even for like the little things, like I know, like Shawn, like you and I have talked about it. Like even if we're walking down the street, it makes you or like the disabled person feel like someone's good deed for the day. And you're not there to fill someone else's need for that, right? Like I just don't agree with it. And I think I totally agree with your perspective.
And one of the things, a couple of months ago, I live near an assisted living facility, and I was coming back from getting groceries. I was in a grocery delivery service car, and we were driving past the facility, and there was a gentleman out there walking his dog, and he was on crutches. And the guy driving looked at him as we drove past, and he was like, "Oh, that poor guy. His life must be so." I didn't say anything. And I just remember thinking, how dare you? How dare you say that? Because not only are you saying it, you're saying it thinking that, you are somehow being a good person by saying this, by acknowledging how badly you think someone else's life is. When meanwhile, perhaps that person has been disabled his whole life. Perhaps not, but perhaps he has. Maybe this is all he's known. Maybe this is just how he moves. Like the arrogance, to be perfectly honest, in, assumptions like that, in people who think they mean well, or people who do mean well, and yet say these completely egregious things. It's laughable in many ways, and also frustrating, right? Because those are the kinds of well-meaning attitudes that keep the system the way that it is.
You're right, though, that they think that they're, like, I've had people tell me that I'm so brave and you're amazing and all those things. And they think they're complimenting you, and they don't understand how it is offensive. And actually, I've gotten into, a rant on Facebook about something like this, and people really push back. Like they're just trying to be helpful. They're just trying to be nice, or you're being too sensitive. It's really hard for people to grasp.
Yeah. How about people find other ways of being nice? Other ways of trying to help. What I am saying here is that those ways of being nice and helping are not working.
Mm-hmm. I want to share a few examples from your book, because I want people to read it. I just think it was a really great way to understand some of these concepts by kind of comparing them to fairy tales, or pointing out the, I guess, inequities in fairy tales, like the fact that it is always the evil character that is disfigured or scary or doesn't look like everybody else. When did you become aware of that?
So the story goes, I was at a writing retreat in 2018 in the summer, off the coast of Seattle. And I was actually working on the novel that would become The Centaur's Wife, which is just published. And I was having trouble with it. So I went for a walk, and I was in this retreat on this farm, and it had this lovely wooded area that you could go for hikes through. And as I was walking, I was thinking about how magical and how fairy tale a setting the woods were. And at the same time, I was thinking about how inaccessible the woods were, even for me, because I had a walking stick from my the cottage that I was staying in. And I found it quite helpful as I was moving through the forest, helpful to pick out twigs and branches and stuff sticking up from the ground, which I almost always trip over if I don't have, a walking stick of that kind with me. And then I was thinking about how, the forest keeps disabled people out. But then I was thinking, but, the magic of fairy tales, of which forests are so often a part, actually have lots of disabled people in them. And it was like this lightning flash of realization just kind of came over me. And it was like, oh, right, because you've got, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. You have the stepmother in Snow White, who in the Disney version transforms herself into this old hunchbacked woman as a way of deceiving Snow White. You have in Cinderella, one of the original versions of the tale, the stepsisters cut off their toes and then the back of their heel to fit in the slipper. And the idea is that they are intentionally disfiguring themselves because their inner souls are as ugly as that. And then, of course, I thought of Beauty and the Beast, and I thought of how the Beast in, a lot of the tales is this kind of not disfigured man necessarily, but he's this being who looks other, right? He's been made to look different as a way of teaching him a lesson. And it seemed so obvious all of a sudden that I was like, well, I'd like to write an essay about this, but clearly it is so obvious that many people who are much smarter than I am have written about this before. And I left the retreat and did some research and found that there wasn't actually as much out there as I thought there would be. So my idea for the essay got larger and larger, and then eventually it became a proposal for a book, which my agent and I took it to Coach House Books in Toronto, and they said yes. And it kind of all came together from there, and it flowed very easily. I wrote the whole book probably within the span of about 6 months, which is pretty fast for me.
Wow.
Yeah.
It definitely took a lot longer to write the novel. I will say that. But it was interesting. I feel like I needed to get to a certain point in my life where I was more comfortable with, writing about disability before I could really delve into what the connections were in that book and what my own personal connections to that book would be.
You talked about the Little Mermaid in the book quite a bit, and the idea of like she wanted legs and she wanted to be able to walk, and the symbolism of that was so just blew my mind. I'd never thought of it that way, but yeah, so interesting. And I know when I was watching Disney movies growing up, I never thought about when will there be a princess who is blind, but I definitely I knew I would never be a princess. Like I knew that just was not anything that could ever be my reality. So yeah, the messages that tells us when we have disabilities. Yeah, it was so great. Thank you for writing that book.
Yeah, it's amazing.
You just grow up in the world thinking as a disabled child, especially that you get all these signs that the world is just not built for you, but also that nobody is invested in changing the way that the world is built for you. And I thought about that a lot in later years because I hated gym class when I was in elementary school. I just hated it. I was never coordinated. I was not very good, but there was never any well, maybe we'll try a different kind of sport today, or maybe we'll do yoga, or maybe we'll, just go for a hike with the kids. None of that. The structure always was, we'll play dodgeball, or we'll play flag football, or we'll run around the track, right? And people were timed, and it was a competition, and I was always bad at the competitions. And that really impressed upon me the ways in which, the world has a system and the world is not going to change. And if you exist outside of that system, then that's just too bad for you.
Yeah, for me, it was volleyball, basketball, and badminton. All these games with things flying through the air, which not a chance of being able to do well.
Mine was similar too, except I think for mine, they did what they thought was best, which was you can go walk around the field while we all play a game, or you can sit in the corner and we'll all play the game, or we'll play pass with you. So I guess they were trying, but I mean, it wasn't, again, I can do more things than they're thinking my disability can. And I think also, Shawn, to your point, I never thought I'd be a princess either, because even in class photos, or you're wearing a dress, it's like, oh, let me take your cane so you can get a good picture, or you want your cane out of the picture. I get that so often. It's ridiculous. And I'm like, oh yeah, it's ugly. Obviously I don't want it in my picture. Even when I was crossing my graduation stage, They're like, we can just guide you across so you don't have to have your cane in the pictures. So just things like that just kind of show you that, of course, there's going to be no toys with wheelchairs. Of course, there's going to be no doll of Jinnie with a cane. Like, there's just, I never thought of that either. And I think, like, pointing those signs out is so important. And I've never said, no, I want my cane in the picture, because I've been conditioned to think that way, right? So I think it's very important and valuable to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
When did you know that you wanted to go into writing, and what made you lean towards this field?
So I've always known that I wanted to be a writer. When I was 5 and in preschool, I was writing little stories. And my mom has this school memories book. Well, technically I have it now somewhere down in the basement. But it was a school memories book where each page had a pocket on the inside, and you could put like assignments from, grade 1 or grade 2 in those pockets. And so I have that. And on each of those pages, there's, when I grow up, I would like to be. And when I was like 5 and 6, I was putting in, I would like to be an author. So it's always something I've been interested in. It's always been something I wanted to do. The question was always, there was kind of talk about building a different society. There was always this kind of assumption that being a writer was never something that was going to make me a lot of money. So I would have to do something else that would make me money. And so I'm 38 now, and I've been working in the sort of writing area, freelancing field for probably the better part of the last 20 years. And so the large, part of that work was, yes, doing my own work as a freelance writer, but also trying to figure out how to operate in the writing community. Like, what kind of job was I going to have as a writer? Was I going to be a teacher? Was I going to be, did I want to work in publishing? All of these kinds of things. And then all along the way, I was working just a succession of, odd jobs and things, working in administration, things that didn't necessarily have anything to do with writing, but were just, jobs that I could have that would pay the bills. And over the last 5-6 years since I started working for The Fold, that has all kind of coalesced into this beautiful, like, everything is perfect, because I have a job where, my writing skills are put to use in the communication side of things. I write a lot of grants. I do all of our communications. I update our website and do all that sort of stuff. But then also in terms of the networking and the connection and the community, the festival itself has a really pivotal role to play in highlighting marginalized voices in Canada and around the world. And I really feel like my passions as a writer and then also as a disability advocate have been married together really nicely in this particular job. And it also leaves me time for my own writing. And the great thing about that is that the more that I write and the more that I publish, the more it shines a light on The Fold. And the more that, my work with The Fold becomes known, the more that shines a light on my own stuff and my own output as a writer. So it's a really nice marriage of things. And I feel very lucky that I, have kind of made it into this particular point in my life where I'm at right now. It was hard though, because I think the reality is that, writing is not, especially in Canada, it's not a financially lucrative career. In most cases. And so that is a question that I think most writers have to reckon with, is that, what am I going to do to keep me in a position where I can continue writing? What's going to pay the bills? And that's a different question for everybody, right? Some people think that it's better for them if they're working in a job that has nothing to do with their writing. That can be really fulfilling and really, fire your creative brain in very particular ways. And then other people find, work within the community in ways that they find really fulfilling and enriching. Does that answer your question, Jinnie?
Oh yeah, it does. And I am similar in that way, that I always knew I wanted to do it, but then I too got a lot of setback, which I know if our listeners have read the blog, I did talk about that on there. So that actually brings me to my second question, which is kind of a two-parter. I know that in my undergraduate degree that I'm doing right now for writing, I've experienced a lot of challenges, some of them being, having marks reduced on my formatting, or having, in class things when I can't read the board, or not being able to navigate writing events at my school because, they're out of class time and I still want to learn and grow. And I'm wondering if, you had any, challenges of your own while completing your degree. And if so, how did you overcome them?
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say that I had challenges in particular with getting my work out. Sort of, I wasn't in need of particular accommodations that, weren't already met by the way that the class was structured. I do think there is a growing wider awareness of the need for those kinds of accommodations in classes. We're nowhere near where we need to be. And I'm sorry, Jinnie, to hear that, has been your experience. I think for me, when I was writing, one of the things that was, took a long time for me to quote unquote overcome was this idea that I needed to be writing a particular kind of literary story, Alice, who I love, in order to be taken seriously as a writer in Canada, especially.
Yes.
The sense that, I needed to write stories where real things happened. And it wasn't until the last year of my undergrad that I started experimenting with stories that were different. I wrote, the sort of germ of a story, which eventually, long years later, became my first novel, The Miracles of Ordinary Men. And it really, was a journey getting to that point of being comfortable with what I wanted to write about, what I found interesting. And key for me in there was understanding that even if that writing wasn't ever hugely successful, it was still going to be really successful for me personally to be writing something that I really enjoyed and found exciting. And so that, marked a huge moment of growth for me, I think. And I mean, it wasn't even a moment of growth, right? It took a long time.
Yeah.
Realization and to get comfortable with that writing voice. But I think too, one of the things that I realize now looking back is I graduated in 2006 from getting my bachelor's degree from the University of Victoria. So I was 24. And then I went and I did my master's degree in Scotland, and I graduated when I was 25, almost 26. And I had this sense that once I finished my schooling, I was done developing as a writer. I was like ready to, write books and have them take over the world kind of thing. And actually what has happened, I think, is that in terms of my sort of writer psyche and development, the bulk of that has happened within the last decade or so since I've left graduate school. It's been a little more than a decade, 2008. So what's that? 13 years ago? Yeah, 13 years ago. And that has meant even more to my development as a writer. But the technical stuff that I learned when I was in my undergrad and, all that early sort of stuff, that has obviously, stood me in good stead in these intervening years. But I guess it just, has been a real learning process and understanding that you're always growing as a writer. You're always kind of discovering new things that excite you, but getting to that point where I understand what my voice is now as a writer and the things that I'm really trying to explore, that has been really exciting. And I hope the same for you. That's
important because I'm someone who thinks that my degree is everything, and that I also too want to go into my master's, and I think that's everything. I need to get perfect A's on all my stories, and I guess it's really not, because there are a lot of authors who didn't really get a creative writing degree and who are still authors.
And if I can just say, I think it's a normal thing in the creative writing sphere, right? Because in the academic sphere, because essentially what you're doing is you're trying to put grades on an artistic discipline. And I don't know if always mesh up as neatly as we would like them to. Like, it's really hard to, sort of numerically, in the way that you have to do when you grade, look at a short story, and they're so influenced by perception, right? And what a reader enjoys and doesn't enjoy. And so it took a long time for me to get a handle on that too, because I was the same way. I needed to get perfect A's on my stories, and I needed to do really well in order to think that, to have confidence in myself as a writer. And it's, I've had to let go of that over the last few years and really just understand that the voice that matters the most is my own, and what I think about my stories is what matters the most.
I think you answered my next question, which is going to be if you had any advice for writers with disabilities, such as myself.
If I can tack on one little
yeah,
I think with writers who have disabilities, I think it's a multifaceted thing, right? Because I think there's power in writing about your disability specifically. There's an anecdote that I put in Disfigured where I was walking down a street in Hamilton once and realized that, my whole life I had sort of been saying, why don't I walk like everybody else? And the realization was, well, it's not that you don't walk like everybody else. It's that nobody else in the world walks the way that you do. So it's that shift in perspective, right? From being an outsider to being someone who actually has a lot of insight and has a lot to give to the world and a lot to share with the world. And I think for writers with disabilities, that's something that I really encourage people to do. Write about your disability if you'd like to, and look at it as, from the perspective of offering insight about something that is unique to you, something that only you know. And at the same time, I don't want writers to feel like if you call yourself a disabled writer, I don't want people to feel limited by that, right? I don't want people to feel like they must only ever write about disability or about their disability. I do believe in a world where we all can tell whatever stories we want. This gets into a whole other conversation, but I don't want people to feel like because their life has been shaped in a particular way by disability, their writing then has to be shaped by that in that particular way for everything, right? Don't be limited by perceptions of things, if that makes sense.
In The Centaur's Wife, the main character has cerebral palsy, so I'm assuming is based on you somewhat. How closely is she?
Well, she has a limp much like mine. I think in the book, hers is maybe a little bit more severe than mine. And that was interesting for me because, her disability is so pivotal to the book and her sort of story within the book about she has a lot of complicated grief about losing her father when she was young. And there's things woven up in that with her disability. But also, it was interesting for me because I don't have kids. And this main character that I'm writing has just children to two twins to two little girls at the beginning of the novel. And the way to get into her for me as a character was to write from the perspective of someone who has a disability and is nervous. I mean, I am nervous about how my disability would impact or not impact my ability to have kids, right? My ability to carry babies, for example. I always worry that I'll trip or that my arm will give out and I will drop an infant. So these are always, and I wrote from that place of fear. I really used that as a way to guide me when I was writing her. So that was interesting for me in how I could use disability to illuminate something that, was not my own experience.
Well, she also really has a lot of walls up. And I get it. I totally get it. And, I don't know. It was she's such a complex character, but I could relate to her in so many ways. That whole, I need to prove myself. I don't need anybody kind of way of being, but really at the same time, really wanting to belong and all of that. It was, very well written.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
There's actually one, I think we're not giving anything away to say, there's like fireballs falling from the sky at the beginning of the book and everybody has to hide and they come out into this broken world. And she eventually finds the only the only shoes that will fit her are these like boots that are too big because she can't fit in like that. I'm sure that's not supposed to be like a pivotal moment in the book or anything, but for me, it was just such a like really clear example of, a basic thing that wasn't going to work well for her.
And I think that's interesting, right? Because then you get into, what often happens with depictions of disability is they're written by people who are not disabled or, maybe don't have the particular disabilities that are portrayed in a book, although they may have other disabilities. And you can often tell, I think, because there is not that attention to those small little mundane details, which, for me, like growing up, I had to wear shoes that were 2 different sizes, right? Because my right foot was twisted and misshapen in ways that my left foot was not. And that was the only way that I could move through the world and wear shoes that, quote unquote matched. And it's a tiny little detail. And it's, as you say, not a pivotal detail to my life, but it is a detail that I recognize. And it's a detail that other people who have CP have recognized when they've read the book, right? And there's something really powerful about reading, particularly when you haven't seen yourself or your body or the way that you move through the world represented in fiction. It's really moving to be able to see it in books and stories and television and movies when you have grown up not seeing it. And I think that goes back to, what I was talking about earlier, where I feel over the last couple of years that I've really kind of understood the power and the responsibility in writing from a disabled perspective is because you're writing both for yourself. I'm writing for myself, obviously, writing the stories that I would have liked to have read when I was younger, but also writing for people out there who are still waiting for those stories. I think as writers, we're in a position to be able to give those stories to people. And it's fun to be able to do that, right? To be able to recognize that magic and understand that you can have a part in playing that.
There was another moment at the beginning where they're coming out of the basement in the hospital and her husband kind of takes her, like he's trying to support her as she's walking and he doesn't want her to be carrying the baby. And she's like, I'm fine. I don't know. That overly helpful, like, I don't know. It was just so, yes.
Yeah, so relatable. Like people trying to help you on the street when you don't need it, or people always being like, are you sure this is a good idea? Even like, her walking into the forest, like I kind of noticed that correlation between both of the books. There's, in Disfigured, we have you walking in the forest and kind of being like, yes, this is challenging. And then we have this character here, who you're, kind of using to change the narrative, who is like, I can do this. Like, I know everyone's worried, but it is possible. And I think I really loved that because, she does, I mean, I hope this is not spoiling, but she like says to Tasha, she's like, it's fine. Like it's okay. And I'm like that. I have that attitude sometimes where it's not as polite and I can just resonate it with so much. And yeah. And I think too, with the representation of disabled characters in stories and, us being the ones to tell those stories. One of the questions I did have, and this is for, all of us, is do we think that disabled characters are represented accurately, if at all, in the literary world? And what do we think about that? Because I know for myself, in classes, we will read about every minority pretty much, and those are really, really important, but it's quite rare that in classes I will read about disability or have people talk about it.
Well, I think it all goes back to that people being uncomfortable with disability, right? And think that disability is this kind of lesser way of being in the world. So people are uncomfortable. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to think about it because in looking at it and thinking about it, they might have to, God forbid, consider the ways in which society is not and the ways in which we have responsibilities to disabled people that we are shirking. But also, people are uncomfortable because they don't visually like the representation of disability in ways. And because they don't like that, because they're uncomfortable with it, people treat disability as this niche thing that's only for disabled people to read. And that, you know, is always an interesting thing when I think back to workshop. And this is something that often gets talked about now with other marginalizations as well, right? This idea that if you're writing about a particular marginalization that isn't, you know, the white, hetero, cis, able-bodied viewpoint, you're somehow alienating your reader, because that is the only reader. The white, hetero, cis, able-bodied reader is the only reader that you're writing for, right? And I think we need to do away with that assumption, obviously. One of the things that I think about is when I think about the question of representation is, you know, there was a movie, you both probably know of it, called, I think it was called A Marriage Story, with Scarlett Johansson and Adam Driver, which came out last year. And it was this, you know, portrayal of a fairly toxic relationship between two artists. And I think about that, and I think, you know, most people do not go see a movie like that and then come out of it thinking, my gosh, I'm never getting married, ever, because they understand, because the media has shown them so many different representations of marriage throughout the years. And we've seen, you know, in film, in television, in books, in conversations that we have, in commercials, in ads that you see on the side of the bus, you see all of these representations of what it means to be married in the world, right? And people understand that there are billions of ways to be married. So we can see one depiction of marriage on TV and understand that this is just one way of it, right? That's not the whole way. But stories that we tell about disability are so limited and so few and far between that when people talk about disability in the wider world, particularly from a non-disabled audience, they only ever think of one or two examples of disability that they've seen in film or in stories, right? They think of Tiny Tim from The Christmas Carol. They think of Amanda Lewis's portrayal of Christy Brown in My Left Foot. It's getting a little bit better now. There have been more portrayals over the last couple of years that are showing disability in a wide variety of experiences. But they also, you know, think of things like, I forget the character's name, but the Me Before You, which was that book by
yes,
and it was made into a movie. And then there was the one, The Upside, I think, which came out last year or the year before with Bryan Cranston, who again, and that's a particular narrative, right, where it's the person who was previously non-disabled, who is made disabled through course of an accident. But my point being that we storytellers, particularly non-disabled storytellers, have limited themselves when it comes to disability in very particular ways, only telling one or two kinds of disability stories, hardly ever disability stories about joy. And if they are disability stories about joy, that is kind of like a triumph in and of itself. Like, oh my gosh, look at this disabled person who manages to find a happy ending. Like, isn't that just so amazing? When the reality of it is that disabled people are 25% of the population, if not more, and live widely varied and widely wonderful lives. And I think it's, you know, we really need to increase disabled representation in all of the media that we consume. And it needs to be disabled representation that comes from disabled creators first and foremost, because disabled creators, as we have talked about, are the ones who know about those small little mundane details, which maybe don't make a lot of difference to a non-disabled audience, but go a huge way toward making a portrayal authentic and really speaking to what it means to occupy a disabled body in the world.
Yes, definitely.
Yes.
Are you working on another book? I know you just very recently seen. I mean, this one just got published, so I'm not rushing you along. But
tell us about the idea in your head.
I am working on a new novel, and I also have a nonfiction book that I'm sort of tossing around. We'll see how long it takes for those to come out. It's been a bit of a rush putting two books out in the midst of a global pandemic. So I don't know what it feel like next spring when I don't have a book to put out. It's going to be feeling very strange, I think.
Are you planning to continue to have characters with disabilities in your novels? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah. And that, you know, is a good question for me to make sure that I do things thoughtfully, because I I am obviously going to be writing characters who limp and, the different manifestations of cerebral palsy, but I would also like to look at portraying other disabilities in ways that I think are important. I think all storytellers have a responsibility to include disability in their stories. But the ones that are, written from a main character's perspective, those are the ones that we give priority to disabled creators. And if I am going to be writing stories or, another novel that has a main character who maybe has a disability, but it isn't a disability that I have, I want to make sure that I'm being very respectful and, consulting with sensitivity readers and just being very careful and intentional about that and making sure that I'm not taking space away from someone else's story. But it's early days yet for the new novel. It's more just like a bunch of words on a page at this point. There's no real rhyme or reason to them. So we'll see.
That's an interesting question because I'm not a writer, although it's one of those things. One day I'd love to write a book, but I have no training, no nothing. But do you know the whole story before you even start writing? Like the Centaur's wife, did you know how it would end?
No, I didn't. But the Centaur's wife, that grew out of a short story. And the short story is quite different from the way that the novel eventually ended up. That one, it was a process of, the short story I wrote in 2014, and then it came out on shelves in 2021. So it's sort of been a 7-year process. And I'd say 3 years of that. So from the beginning of 2016 to the end of 2019 was really intensive drafting and redrafting. I think I rewrote the book 6 times over the course of that 3-year period. And that one I didn't know, and I was sort of figuring it out as I went along. With this new book, I lied when I said that it's just words on a page. I have spent most of the last year thinking about it, and I think being the key words, I think I know what this one is going to do in terms of the arc, like how it's going to begin and how it's going to end, and the sort of through line that's going to carry it all the way to the end. Mm-hmm. But we'll see. I have to finish a draft first, and then it needs to go, to a reader who will read it and tell me if I am on the mark or if I am way off and need to rewrite the whole thing.
Wow. That's so cool.
Yeah.
It's just amazing to me that you can create just like an idea of a story into an entire book with I don't know, the Centaur's wife just had so many different characters and interesting, so
viewpoints
much to it. Mm-hmm.
There was like different viewpoints throughout the whole book, which I really loved as well. And then, there'd be a viewpoint and then it'd reach the time that the book last left off with and connecting.
Well, we are over an hour. I am conscious of time. I feel like we could talk to you all day. I want to thank you so much for joining us today, Amanda. It's been such a pleasure to meet you, to read your books, to hear your wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Shawn and Jinnie. And it's just been so lovely to talk to both of you. I really, really appreciate your asking me to come on the show.
Yeah.
And thank you, Jinnie, for introducing me to Amanda's writing.
Yeah, it's great. Everybody check it out.
Yeah, read her books.
Yes, everybody read my books, please.
Yes.
They're also available on Sella and on Nels for anyone who needs a Braille copy and an audiobook recorded by Victoria Carr.
And also on Audible. You can purchase them on Audible as well. Yeah. All right. You've been listening to Limitless, the Blind Beginnings podcast. I'm your host, Shawn Marcellet. If you have a question, a comment, an idea, a topic for a future episode, send us an email to limitless@blindbeginnings.ca. And please join us again next time.
This podcast has been brought to you by Blind Beginnings, an organization based in Vancouver, Canada, that supports children and youth who are blind or partially sighted, along with their families. Music for this podcast is composed by Sean Bishop and Clement Chow. Production and audio editing by Rob Minot. For more information about Blind Beginnings and the work it does to support children and youth who are blind and partially sighted, along with their families, visit us on the web at www.blindbeginnings.ca, and also remember to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.